Before we get started, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists today. First we have Jamie Scott. He farms about 2,000 acres near Pierceton up in northern Indiana, and he's been committed to cover crops for the past 10 years, building a thriving cover crop business and a consulting operation along the way. And he's also planted over 60 demonstration plots and hosts a lot of field tours each year. We also have Robert Barr. He's a research scientist for the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at IUPUI and focuses broadly on what is needed to maintain healthy stream systems in a continually changing landscape. His main projects include the Indiana Fluvial Hazard Mitigation Program, and that aims to reduce erosion hazard during flooding. And finally, we have Shannon Zezula. He's a native of Wells County, Indiana. He attended Purdue for his undergraduate work and Ohio State University for his graduate work, and currently resides in Brownsburg and oversees the details of the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service in Indiana. Let's welcome our panelists. Well, today we're taking a look at the challenge of hypoxia, and we're going to start out looking at the microscope and then broadening our view out to the Gulf of Mexico. And we're going to talk about what Indiana farmers are doing voluntarily to improve their soils and keep sediment and nutrients on their farms. And we'll also look at some watershed management programs that are going on here in the state to help that issue. When we talk about watershed management programs, we're talking about plans where farmers, several different agencies, and local citizens look at a watershed and the sources of contaminants and nutrients in that watershed and think about how can we reduce the daily load and what kinds of practices can we think about doing and where can we focus our efforts within this watershed. And on the screen is a picture of the Mississippi River watershed, and the green areas are all the states that drain to the Mississippi River and eventually to the Gulf. And most of Indiana, with an exception of a small corner of the northeastern part of the state, does drain to the Mississippi River. So part of a watershed management plan and some of the strategy to help mitigate the problem of hypoxia includes having healthy soil. So let's talk to Shannon first. Shannon, what is this concept of soil health, and why are Indiana farmers getting on board with this concept?
Well, the term soil health is relative. You can go to the next slide. Is just a term. And farmers have been doing different levels of management throughout history, and how they manage their farm dictates, their yield. It dictates their sustainability, their resiliency to drought and flood, and it also then impacts how much nutrients leaves their farm, how much sediment leaves their farm. What we've finally found out by listening to some key farmers here in Indiana, and even across the nation, is that they're managing their soil. And their soil is actually functioning. For the longest time, the science has looked at soil as from the chemical standpoint and from the physical standpoint. You put enough nutrient in the soil, you can grow a crop. But what we've overlooked is the biological part of that soil. But a lot of our key farmers here in the Midwest have really discovered what that is, and that's what we call the term soil health. And what we treat the soil as a living organism and think more of the biological processes. But the term soil health, cover crops, these things have really caught on across, especially the media, for farmers across the Midwest. So we want to make sure that you all understand, from an Indiana perspective, what we mean by soil health. Because it's kind of taking on its own little bit of energy here, and people are making it what they want it to be, rather than what farmers are needing it to be. So we want to make sure that we all understand what we talk about when we say soil health. And when a farmer is managing in a high conservation cropping system that improves soil health, they're actually increasing their organic matter. And everyone knows that if you're going to buy a farm, do you want nice, dark, deep soil to purchase? Or do you want the tannish, almost white soil? Which one's better? The deep, dark, right? That's because of organic matter. Farmers know this. Most gardeners know this. High organic matter means good productivity, good everything else. these farmers are improving their aggregate stability, and I'll show you what that means, because we want to also not just talk to you, we want to show you what soil health is. You'll leave here with a good understanding of that. These farmers are also increasing their water infiltration. You know, as it rains in the spring, or we get these summer rains, those crops need that water into the soil. But what we're going to show you is, through management, that can happen or it cannot happen. Once that water's in the soil, we want that soil to hold that water. We don't want it just to blow out through the tile. We want that organic matter to hold on to that water, so that when it turns dry in August, that corn plant or that bean plant has access to water and can actually then bump up the yield and do all the good things that the farmers want it to. We're also improving nutrient cycling in these systems. You know, the nutrients just aren't leaving. They're staying on the field, and that's a good thing. And now those nutrients then are available to the next year's crop. And so these farmers are seeing that, and they're reaping the rewards of that. And like I mentioned, they're also enhancing and diversifying their soil biology. So how are they doing this? Go ahead, Elise. It's really through 4 key principles. And this is all involved with management. And these are not new concepts. It's just they finally kind of started to come together, and we found some of the missing pieces and the missing technology to help farmers be successful in implementing these systems. And first, we're minimizing disturbance. You got to stop disturbing the soil. When you disturb the soil, you interrupt the biology, you interrupt the habitat of the microorganisms down there. It's not going to function right. Maximize soil cover. You know, here in Indiana and across the Corn Belt, we are lucky to have a growing plant on our fields from about, May? And then we go through senescence about September or so. So from May to September, we might have something growing, doing something for us. But then come October after harvest and up through April and planting, a lot of times there's nothing. So really, you know, land around here, just good farmland, decent, not even good farmland, just average farmland is $8,000 to $10,000 an acre. It's probably not unlike anywhere else in the Midwest. You know, that's a significant investment. And so these farmers that are managing these systems are using the sun's free solar energy and helping build organic matter year-round, protecting that soil and getting the benefits. Maximizing biodiversity. You know, our monocultures of corn bean, that's not much diversity, but these farmers are increasing diversity through the use of cover crops and others. And then they're also providing that continuous living root through the cover crop system through that fall time. So what I want to do is stop talking and start showing. So, you know, these concepts all sound good. You know, we've been promoting no-till and cover crops and nutrient management, all these things that are great for the farm, great for the environment. But we really have seen a huge surge recently because we've started to show farmers how their soil can function. 1, how their soil is functioning, and 2, what the potential is. So what I want to do is show you some key demonstrations that we do in front of farmers and helps us explain the story to us. Here I have 2 different soils. And I'm just going to walk these up and down. If you can see them, light might not be good, but I don't know if anyone can see a difference in these 2 soils. Anyone tell a difference? Color? One of them is what? Maybe a little darker than the other? Texture? Well, if anyone's familiar with the soil survey that our agency puts out, these are the exact same soil type. These have the exact same percent clay, percent sand, percent silt, the exact same soil type. The difference is in management. This soil on your left, my right, has been managed under continuous no-till for over 10 years. It's also had cover crops planted on it for 7+ years. Continuous cover crops every fall. This soil is what we would call our typical management system here in Indiana. This is what we would call a conservation tillage system. Now, I don't know if these terms are familiar with you or not, but we have a no-till / never-till over here, and then a conservation tillage. So what happens here is we get our soybeans are no-till, but our corn then is chisel plowed, just a typical chisel type tillage system. No cover crops. So what we show farmers is what happens when your soil is submerged in water. And you know, if everyone from around this area knows, past however many springs, past however many winters, we've had some pretty significant rain events. 2+ inches, 4+ inches. So our soils are subject to pretty severe rains. So I'm going to drop these in the water and just see what happens. And then I'm going to put 2 of them in there so we can actually see something happen. So what I want to do is ask you, how do we think we would want our soils to function? Can you see that? Can you see a difference? Exact same soil type. The only difference is management. So like I said, farmers have a choice in how they manage their crop. And they're out there, our farmers know how to grow corn, right? And they're successful at it. But some management comes at a cost. Can you all see that? Who can tell me what's going on? Anybody? This isn't Soils 101, this is just, anybody know what's going on? What? Erosion? Why is this soil falling apart? Anyone? Well, what's happening is when these go in to the water is actually moving, rushing. I mean, just think about a tsunami thing. You saw the videos. A tsunami of water rushing right into the pore spaces of the soil. This soil doesn't have what we call aggregate stability. It can't withstand the forces of that water, and so it breaks apart. It's what we call slakes. This soil has stayed put. There is water in this soil. The water is getting in here. It's just able to withstand the pressures of that water. Does anyone know why?
Aggregate stability.
Aggregate stability, great. Look, I can even move this. Look at that. It comes out, the pieces come out, but look at it, it's not even clouding up the water. Because those pieces that fall off they're aggregated. They're staying together. They're just falling to the bottom. These, look at that. Look how dirty that water is. This soil, under continuous no-till and continuous cover crop.
That's an NRCS technical.
Yeah. Look at how technical I am. It has a diverse microbiological community. There's bacteria, there's beneficial fungus, there's nematodes, there's earthworms, there's all kinds of living organisms in this soil. And what they do is they produce these biological glues, glomalin. They have these mycorrhizal fungi that actually hold the soil particles together. Your soil particles are really tiny, but what these biological glues do is they aggregate the individual pieces into PEDs that withstand the pressure of water. Now what that also does is it allows the structure to be half something, half nothing. A soil that is half nothing, or air, and half something, mineral, organic matter, is a healthy soil. It allows for water and air to get into the soil, which helps the crops and exchanges the air and water. This soil here, through tillage, when soil is tilled,
Everybody see that better?
there's a huge flux of oxygen into the soil. Have you all seen the videos where you got one bacteria, and all of a sudden it becomes 2, and then 4, and 8? Well, that's what happened. This system is bacterial driven. As oxygen is incorporated into the soil, and that soil structure is broken up by the tillage equipment, those bacteria is like, hey, yeah, I got my oxygen. I'm ready to eat. And they multiply. But you know what they're eating? They're hungry. You know what they're eating? Organic matter. They're eating the organic matter, the very thing that a farmer needs in their soil to be productive. So, seems like a no-brainer. Why not just stop tilling? It's easy, right? Well, farmers have found out how to do it, but it hasn't been an easy road. So I want to show you one more demonstration here. We'll just put these over to the side. Yeah, that'll work. If we make a mess, that's what we pay registration for.
Notice that I don't fill my beakers up quite this far.
All right, so we're going to show you one more, and then we'll get on to another. What we have here is just a Tupperware with holes in it. I'm going to simulate rain. We've got the same soils in these tubs, and there are holes underneath these, under both of them. And we're going to simulate rain and just see what happens. Because one of the things we talk to farmers is, farmers don't till just for the sake of tilling. They don't like to just pull big pieces of metal behind them and spin diesel fuel and everything else. They're doing it for a purpose. They know how to grow corn. It's been successful for them, their dad, their grandpa. One of the reasons why people till is to get water into the soil, because a nice, soft, well-worked soil allows water in, right? So what we're going to show you here, Bob, do you mind helping me?
I'd like to.
You take that one. Bob's going to have the long-term no-till cover crop soil. Well, if you hold that up, Bob, and let's walk that around. Can you walk that like this?
I can.
And see if you can tell the difference here.
I can even walk and do it.
Here's my soil. Take a look at Bob's. What's going on? Bob, you got a leak.
I do.
You did it wrong, Bob.
I did.
Doggone.
I got a leak.
No, that's what we want. Look at my soil. Look at this water.
Yeah, water come through there.
You see that water sitting on top there? Now what if it were April 15th and we just put down an application of fertilizer, and let's just say we've got, let's say, a 0.5% slope on our field. Where's this water?
Get the sediment in the bottom of my pan.
Water's no longer on the field, is it? Water's probably in the ditch. Water's probably got the nitrogen, the phosphorus, anything else that was tied to it is also in the ditch. Is that where the farmer wants it? So he's not trying to grow ditch vegetation, is he? That's not good. So what we've got here is low infiltration. Because when we have soil that's been disturbed and it's not aggregated as in Bob's soil, the actual first erosion we have is what we call vertical. The raindrops that you've all seen the videos of the raindrop and sploosh. You know, that sploosh is just small soil particles that are unaggregated, and they come back down and they settle down and they seal off the surface. So trying to work that soil up to get water in is actually having the opposite effect. It's making that soil not capable of withstanding the forces of those raindrops. This is after the first rain. When this dries, what do we have? Anybody familiar with farm fields after a rain? Everybody seen crusting?
Yep.
Now, crusting is not a farmer's friend. So a lot of times they have to go back in and replant to help those, you know, especially if the crop hasn't germinated, the seedling can't even bust through that layer. So then the next rain, after crusting, is even worse. So we're trying to get water in the soil to benefit the crop, and it's not getting there. It's running off. And what does that do? Not only the nutrients, the sediments, but flooding, some other impacts on that. When we show farmers how their soil can function, again, $8,000 to $10,000 an acre, that's a significant investment. If you're losing it in the bottom of your ditch, or it's all going down to the bottom of the low spot of your field and crusting you over, that's just not what most farmers want. They want this. And how do you get there? And this is not easy. A quality no-till system, or what we call a never-till system. And we emphasize, notice we have a lot of adjectives here. We emphasize the adjectives because quality no-till is not just stopping tillage. You can't just stop tillage and expect success. You've got to pay attention to the details. You've got to manage the system. You've got to manage everything else, because as you stop tilling the soil, the biology starts to increase. And the biology starts, they're hungry. They're eating the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the organic matter, but they're eating it. Something else is eating that and releasing it to the crop, releasing it to build more organic matter. Organic matter is taking up nitrogen and phosphorus. You've got to manage the whole system. We're looking at diverse and strategic cover crops. Again, we want that living root year-round. We want that cover year-round. The cover crop is feeding the biology as well. It's busting through compaction layers. It's putting organic matter deep in the soil. It's taking the sun's energy through photosynthesis and putting organic carbon back into the soil, where it's going to help the farmer, help society. Adapted nutrient management. Like I mentioned, when you stop tilling the soil, the biology just starts to flourish. But they're the first feeders to the trough. If you don't adapt your nutrient management and you go to plant corn into the first year of no-till, but you don't change how you've applied your nitrogen or your phosphorus, your corn's going to suffer, because it's not available to it. That soil is wanting to build organic matter, and that's where the nitrogen is gone. So you've got to adapt and offset that. Integrated weed and pest management. When you start incorporating cover crops and you start no-tilling, you get a different suite of pests. You just have to be on top of it. Scouting and being prepared to treat it if needed. Not just willy-nilly applying insecticides and pesticides and herbicides for the sake of it, but doing a good job of scouting and being on top of new pests that might be out there. Diverse crop rotations. We're trying to get wheat back into our rotations, other unique crops besides just corn, bean. Precision farming technology. I mentioned minimizing disturbance. One of the biggest disturbances in our cropland is the equipment itself. Compaction, trafficking. Our field, if farmers are just not thinking about where they're driving, they're just, the very first pass through a piece of heavy equipment does the most damage for compaction. So you try to minimize the amount of wheel traffic an individual field gets. So you have some sacrifice areas under the wheels, good low compaction in the other parts. And then prescriptive buffers. There's just some places here in the Midwest that the soil, the inherent soil properties, are just not really conducive to growing a crop. They're either too wet, too dry, too something. You know, farmers almost know now how much each individual corn or seed costs. That's how much corn costs nowadays for a bag of corn. You can almost put it down to how much each kernel costs. That's pretty expensive stuff. So if you're putting, you know, 30,000 population on soil that's not ever going to get it, and you're putting the nutrients and everything else along with it, you're kind of wasting your money. So we talk to farmers about finding those areas through their yield monitors, taking them out and maybe putting them into some sort of a buffer system or other that they're not, and then spend all those resources and time on the better parts of their fields to maximize production there.
So when we're thinking about these soil demonstrations and why the soil behaves as it does in the water, can you go a little bit more in depth as to why that happens?
Okay. Again, it comes down to helping the habitat. I'm getting a little out there, aren't I? Talking about the living soil, but you know that's actually what's happening. When you destroy the habitat of these microorganisms, you disrupt it. So they're trying to come into this balanced system. As you disturb it through tillage, disturb it through trafficking, you interrupt that, and so it sets you back. When you stop disturbing it, that biology is allowed to start to flourish. It's allowed to start to find that equilibrium of, you know, millions and millions of species of trying to, each one doing their own little thing. One of them breaks down the residue. The others are burrowing holes. The others are going out and releasing phosphorus that's been locked up in the sediment in the rock for so long that's available to the plants. As that system starts to function, then the soil starts to function too. And so, as long as you have a degraded system, you have a chance of runoff. You aren't able to recycle your nutrients. Your water does not get into your soil. Your water, if it does get into the soil, it's not normally held there for very long. And so what all these farmers are seeing is through this system, they're able to withstand the droughts. You know, back in 2012, we have a lot of the farmers that have been doing this during that year, they took a hit too in the drought. That was a severe drought. But you know, the county average yield was about 40 bushel corn. They were getting 120 bushel corn, because the waters that did come in the spring and the late summer was able to get in the soil, was able to be held there, and we had those cover crop roots and corn roots that were deep. These you know, we typically think of corn as having about 8 inches of root depth, because that's the plow layer. You know, and there was a compaction layer there, and those corn roots just can't penetrate it. And so that's what we're managing. These farmers, they've busted through that compaction layer, and these annual cover crops are pushing down roots. These are amazing plants. They put 4 to 6 foot roots in a fall growing period. That root from the cover crop, when that plant dies, and then the earthworms that kind of follow that corn plant, when it germinates, it's like, that's got easy pickings. It just follows that nice easy path deep down. There's nutrients down there, there's water down there. So we're reducing our runoff, we're increasing our infiltration, increasing our water holding capacity. The one thing, and that's really good for sediment and phosphorus, but nitrate is still a leaky substance. If it hits a tile, if it's in water and hits a tile, it'll go out the tile, and then it gets in the ditch and all the way down to the gulf. But these cover crop roots, again in the fall, again when the crop is growing, it's keeping that nitrogen. It's keeping that nitrogen in the plant. But when it goes dormant and harvested, there's nothing there to keep the nitrogen there, and that's when we see a huge flush of nitrate leaving our tile systems. Cover crops are hungry for nitrate. They're grabbing it, putting it into the plant biomass, building organic matter, keeping it there. When that cover crop dies, it's releasing that to the main corn crop or bean crop next year, and it's just this more of a recycling system. And so the farmers are saying, you know, they're adapting their management to look at, well, what do I need to really grow my maximum yield out here? And it's becoming different as these systems mature and they're being able to be more efficient with their nutrients.
So we've looked a lot at the microscope view of what's going on in our soils, and particularly what is going on with conservation systems in Indiana. but we're still about 980 miles from the Gulf if we start from Pierceton, Indiana, where Jamie, your farm is. Can you tell us why this hypoxia issue and soil health matter to an Indiana farmer?
So we're pretty much the farthest point from the Gulf in that area. But really to a farmer, there's a couple of things that matter. Most of the time they'll tell you it's yield, but really it's profitability to a farmer. This system that Shannon just talked about is the most profitable system that we're finding on our farm. And the second thing is sustainability. I mean, it is our goal to allow the next generation to farm just like we've had the opportunity. So really, if you ask a farmer, those two things are what allows them to look at these different systems, things that we've changed over the history of our own farm, because we want it to be sustainable and we want to be profitable to be able to farm the next year. This picture here is a root pit from one of our fields, and as Shannon was talking about, increasing organic matter, root channels in the soil. This root pit is 5 to 5.5 foot deep, and if you could see at the very bottom, there are roots all the way down to the bottom of that soil root pit. So a lot of places that I dig in the Midwest, we're only farming about 10 inches of soil. We're not getting down there. We want a bigger sponge. We want to farm more acres from top to bottom, not just across the top. This is a close-up of one of those root channels, and if you can see, there's brown roots and white roots within that root channel. The very dark streak is where we're increasing organic matter. We're sequestering nutrients to that area. As Shannon talked about, the new root has an easy channel to follow the old one to get to moisture, to get to nutrients. We don't need as much of either one then when we have these systems in place. Another thing is when it rains, we have those root channels for that water to get in the soil rather than run off like Shannon showed. I kind of wanted to show a picture that, you know, we can do a demonstration up in front of what it looks like. This is actually on the farm. This is one of our farms where the left side of the screen is the open ditch that goes back onto our farm. The right part is coming from neighboring systems, that other conventional till system. You can see firsthand, this was a 1-inch rain, how much soil left their farm and how clear it is on our farm here. So this one here. So, you know, you can see the grass in the bottom here and how clear that water is. So the system does work, you know, with this soil as nutrients. When we look at a profitable system, we don't want to send nutrients to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Great Lakes or wherever. We want to keep them on our farm. And that's what we're doing here, as you can see with this slide.
When Jamie shows you that, remember these. That's exactly what you're seeing.
And I've been to places where they say that, you know, Shannon put hairspray on that soil or has done something. And so I want to say that, you know, there's no way we could have went out and hairsprayed the whole, you know, watershed to show that's exactly what does happen. When Shannon talked about diversity, we agree with that. One thing that we had been doing on our farm was we were following the grain prices. Continuous corn was profitable, or appeared to be. But when we looked at the sustainability, we didn't like a monoculture. So what we've done is in this whole soil health system is we've inserted diversity into our farm. This is a 13-way cocktail mix of cover crops. We put wheat on our farm, and then we are seeding this cover crop after wheat. In a 3-year crop rotation on our farm, we now have 20 different species that touch our soil. Different root structures doing different things. We're raising our own fertilizers. In 1 year, it is hard to believe how much this affects that soil health, the color, the tilth, everything of it. So got away from a monoculture and just corn or a small rotation of corn and beans to 20 different species in 3 years on our farm.
Can you give some examples of those species?
There's 4 groups in those different species. So there's legumes to produce nitrogen. There's grasses to hold the extra nutrients and to put roots down and open up root channels. There's brassicas, which are natural biofumigants to take care of pests so that we don't have to use fungicides or insecticides. And then there's broadleafs in there as well. So some of them are definitely sunflowers, buckwheat, There's different clovers, peas, vetches, oats, and then radishes, turnips, and rapeseed that are in there. So, yeah, there's quite a mix in there of warm season, cool season, as well as the 4 different groups. So that diversity that Shannon talked about is very big to soil health. That we have to get those different species, different rotations on the farm to increase it. This is that same field that you saw with the sunflowers. It terminated through the winter, and a few things we had to go in and chemically spray out, but planting right back into it. Shannon talked about we want to never till the soil. That is exactly what we're doing on our farm, and others around are doing. We're increasing different fungus, bacteria in the system to make it work. If you went out in this field today, it actually looks like we tilled that soil. We have enough going on biologically. They have decomposed and recycled those things to where it almost looks like a tilled field. Once we get into the system, we struggle to ever keep enough cover on our field because of what's going on. With corn and beans, we're still putting a cover crop on. As you can see here, our cash crop is still growing, and yet we have a living cover in between the rows of that cash crop. As Shannon talked about, we want to have an active plant growing on our farm 365 days a year. To just raise the cash crop in corn or soybeans or wheat, and then to go to the house and say we're done, that is not what we're after. You know, we have something here that is sequestering the nutrients, holding them in place for us, so if we get a big rain, they're not going off. We're increasing that organic matter. Our soil is still working for us, even in the off season. And this is an example of that in the springtime. That cover crop that was seeded in the cornfield, you can see here, no soil is going to leave that farm. It can rain 1 inch, it can rain 5 inches, and there is nothing that's moving. We don't have the ponding effect. We don't have water standing. We're creating a bigger sponge by using practices like this with the cover crops. Just more examples of it. Here we are again. We've just terminated this field, and now we're planting a crop back into it. So again, just showing that 365 days a year, our soil is covered. All of the pictures that I have shown, there is a stream that borders the fields. And this one, the stream is right here in the edge of the ditch line. So as the slope is heading to there, if we get big rains, if we just had fertilizer on top, that's where it's going to go with the cover crop or the continuous cover, continuous no-till. We are helping with the soil health system. Just another picture of, again, of planting into that living cover. Something that would have scared us 10 years ago, but today, by planting into there, we are keeping everything on our farm and not getting off. Here it is terminated, very easy. We've got the soil protected again, and I think the next one's of the actual bean plants growing. Again, this is what we're after on the farm, is this the end result? But to get the best of that, we have to have continuous no-till, continuous cover crops to get this. The other thing that we think is very important is these beans have been foliar fed or fed throughout the growing season. So on our farm, one of the things that Shannon talked about was nutrient placement or adjustment of that nutrient schedule. We're not just dumping all of our fertilizer out there at one time. These beans, as well as our corn and wheat, everything is being fed at different times throughout the season. So modes of action, and if we would dump everything out there at once and then get a large rain event, like Shannon showed, it has a tendency to wash off. One of the things in our system is that when we fertilize, we only fertilize what that plant would need or what the soil needs yet to hold. It's a balanced system, not just blanket applying or over applying fertilizers to raise a better crop. It's all off of prescription and at different times of the year so that we hopefully miss those big rain events.
So Jamie looked at what's happening on his fields, and we'd like to turn to Bob now and look at how a farmer's actions on one field can translate to results that affect a larger watershed. So what data do we have that shows that these actions are beneficial to the Gulf?
Thanks, Elise. You'll notice that when Elise did the introductions, she told you where Jamie's farm was. She told you the farm that Shannon came from. She didn't say anything about mine. It's because I don't have one. I am the non-Aggie in the group. I am a research hydrologist and a fluvial geomorphologist. I work with streams and waterways. And I have been concerned primarily with a couple of huge questions throughout my career. One is flooding, the problems with flooding. The other one is water quality, and how to link these questions of quantity and quality together. Elise showed you a slide when we started out of the Mississippi River watershed. It is daunting to look at, to think about, 2/3 of the United States coming down into a funnel in the Gulf of Mexico, and anything and everything in that large watershed coming down there as well. You start thinking about the amount of acres that are planted to corn. So in 2012, 93 million, I believe was the number. Shannon knows those numbers better than I, but a huge number of acres of corn, of agriculture coming down into the Gulf of Mexico. It's a breadbasket. And we try to understand what's moving where and how. Major concerns with water quality have always been sediment. Number one to the US EPA, sediment, followed very closely by the nutrients. We look at the phosphorus as traveling in many times in some species with the sediment. Nitrate moving in suspension, the nitrogen moving in suspension, so double pathways, not necessarily traveling in the same way. And we look at all the other products that come on the ground, not only from agriculture, but from urbanization, from residential development, all the different uses on the landscape. And when we start trying to manage the water, we look at something like this. And I put this up here because this is how the Center for Earth and Environmental Science, the group that I'm with, got to start in looking at these watershed dynamics and thinking about them very broadly in terms of how we could manage a watershed. In 2002, the Indianapolis Water Company's manager, Veolia Water International, asked us to look at the Upper Wright River watershed, almost 2,000 square miles, to tell them what they needed to be concerned about, what we saw moving through that watershed, what was going to come into their drinking water plant right here. They wanted to know what they were going to have to deal with. And they asked us to start looking at this. This has parts of 16 counties, 16 Huck-10 subwatersheds, so all the different colors that you see there, all come down into this. We said we would do it. Almost immediately, we saw that we needed more people than we had. So our organization grew to try to look at this. We focused our attention, and if you'll hit the button, Elise, we started focusing our attention particularly on the inflows to 3 major drinking water reservoirs to the city of Indianapolis. One was Eagle Creek, the one that Elise just turned on here is Morse Reservoir, the Cicero Creek watershed, and then this one on the east side of Marion County, Geist with the Fall Creek watershed. Almost all of these watersheds in the larger Upper White focus and have very similar land use characteristics. They have some urbanization, but they're predominantly agricultural. So they are mixed land use watersheds. And the question was, how do we understand this better? We did a summary report for them, we published it, and we said, what we need to do is to really understand this, we think we need to drop down in scale. Now think about this. Our concern is literally the Mississippi River watershed. It's too big, it's huge. So what we need is a proxy. So we'll drop down and we'll think about the upper white. And what I'm saying is, to us, this was too much. So we downsized again. And we downsized to the Eagle Creek watershed, so the watershed for one of the reservoirs. The reservoir is located right here. We identified the sub-watersheds. These are them labeled here on the side. And we created a monitoring system where we could literally leave our offices at the university, not far from here, come up into this watershed, loop through the watershed, turn around and get back on the highway and back down into Indianapolis with our samples in one day. I won't say that they always went slow as they did this, but to get a storm, and you have to understand when you're taking grab samples, which is a term that we're going to use when we go in and we grab a sample. We don't have a continuous reading, so the closer we can get them together, the better the data are. So after heavy rain, if we want to know what's happening in School Branch relative to Fishback, relative to Irishman's Run, and on down the list, the quicker we can collect those samples, the more we know how they relate to each other. Why do we care? Sorry, I'm the teacher in the group. This is going to have to be more interactive here. Why do we care? Why do we care how they relate to each other? What's our ultimate question? What are we trying to understand? We want to know what the water quality issues are, right? We're going to assume that all of these watersheds are not the same, right? We think they might be different. And why do we care if they're different? Where do we want to put our efforts? They might need different management practices. Thank you. They might need different management practices. And as Jamie just pointed out, and as Shannon introduced, we've got a set of management practices. We've got all sorts of things that we can start looking at once we understand where the problems are. What are the soil types? How are they responding? What's planted where? Who's farming closest to the stream? All of these things become important. So we couldn't really tease that out in the upper white. It was a big watershed. It takes us days to get through that and to do it on a field scale. In Eagle Creek, at 163 square miles, we think, okay, maybe we can get around and we can understand what's going on here. At the same time, we see something up here. We weren't quite right. It's still a little big. Still a little big. So what we tried to do is drop down in scale one more time. We picked one sub-watershed, one down here. Again, tributary to Eagle Creek Reservoir, which is significant. It's the public water supply. Do they pay attention to what goes into the drinking water? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So now we've not only got the farmers paying attention to what's going into it, because they're very interested in it as well. One of the things we quickly learned is the farmers care very much whether or not what they're putting on the field is getting in the water. If for no other reason, then it costs a lot of money. And if it's not in the field, it's not doing them any good. When we were doing this work, we went to this sub-watershed right here, School Branch. And we naively said, we're going to go sample some tiles on the farms. And we had colleagues that looked at us and said, you're right. There is no farmer that's ever going to let you sample the tile running off of his field and say, this is what's in it. As I said, I'm the non-Aggie in the group, so I went up and knocked on the door. Asked if I could sample the tile. My response, first response, sure, what are you looking for? That relationship has gone on now for 8 years. I still sample on his farm. His question was, certainly, let me know what you find, because if there's something out there that I'm putting on the field, I want to know what it is. Because if I know what it is, I can think about how to manage it. So when we downscaled to look at this one more time, guess where we went? School Branch, where we already had somebody we were working with that we could talk to, that we could understand what they were putting down and why they were putting it down, when they were putting it down. All these things that we didn't really understand as well as we wanted. When we would see a hit, a spike in some substance in the larger upper light, we would sit around and try to figure out why it was there. What had happened? Was it an application problem? What was it? It was hard to know. And that watershed was so big, it was hard to understand what was happening. Same thing was true in Eagle Creek, 163 square miles. I don't know everybody in that watershed, but no way. In School Branch, I know everybody in this watershed. 8.5 square miles. About 9.5 miles, 10 miles of river from here at the reservoir up to the uppermost headwaters. I can walk this in a day. I can start at the bottom and just walk straight up, and I can see what the whole thing looks like. And I know who's farming here and who's farming here. We can even look at a distribution of cropping in there. In the image on my right-hand side over here, we can see green for beans, we can see yellow for corn. We started looking at this watershed very carefully, and we decided what we really wanted to do. So we wanted to focus back on that one field. We wanted to think about what one farmer's management practices did. Opportunely, NRCS came up with a new program called Edge Field. NRCS's first sampling program that they're administering themselves as a cost share, like a typical NRCS program, as a cost share with the farmer. So this is a pretty remarkable thing. People looked at the initial offering and said, yeah, right, who's going to do that? You're asking a farmer, and the commitment time is a minimum of 6 years up to 9 years. So you're asking a farmer in an edge of field practice to maintain their management practices for a 6-year period, to collect base level data for 2 years, baseline, so we know what's going on, then to make a change in practices and then monitor it for another 4 years. And you're asking them to help pay for it. And the NRCS pulled out, really, I think, all the good information they could about how things had been sampled. I told you that we were taking grab samples. It is a frustration because you never know. If somebody says, well, what was the highest level of nitrogen you saw? What was the peak in number that you saw on that watershed? And you report your measurements that you took from grab samples. And if it's not as high as they want, what do they say? You missed it. You missed it. And if it's really high, what do others say? Well, it's usually not that high. It's usually lower than that. You just missed the low ones. And what's your answer to that when you're taking samples once a week or once a month? Maybe. I don't know. I don't have data there. So what we knew we needed was continuous monitoring. We needed automated samplers that collected data around the clock, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, all through the year. Because in the university world, we know that if we get a really big storm that we want to catch, it's going to come at midnight during a holiday, when everybody's gone and you're calling people and you say, yeah, I know you're at your wedding, but can you come back and sample? and some of them say yes and some of them don't. And so, but when we try to drag the team back, we get that kind of response. So we need continuous automated monitors. So NRCS spec'd those. They said not only is this going to be good, you got to do it. And you know what? The other thing you're going to do is you're going to run these things year-round. Because one of the things that we find when we look for things when they're not supposed to be there, When you're the first ones that sample through the year into January and everybody says there's nothing moving in January in Indiana, all of a sudden you go, yeah, there is. Particularly after a big heavy rain. But if you're not geared up to catch that, if your sampling teams aren't ready, if your bottles aren't washed, if you're not ready to deploy, you don't get it. So NRCS said you're going to do it, and so we said we will. And so we went back to the same farmer that we knocked on his door, I think 8 years ago now. And I said, could we do this on your ground? And remember, once again, my tile story, nobody's going to let you do this. Well, this is true again, because everybody said there's no farmer that is going to pay to have you do this. So we knocked on his door and said, what do you think about this? He said, yeah, let's do it. Said, okay, so now my phone calls are, is the equipment in yet? Because it's been taking us forever to get in, because it takes a long time to get everything designed, and he wants to know his answers now. So he's saying, we're gonna do this. But if all I know is what's going on in one farm right here, with one set of practices, what do I know? Not too much. Because again, the bigger question is, what's going on down here? Which is going to be accumulation of everything down through this area. Everybody doesn't farm like Jamie. There's a variety of different practices, and there are a variety of different producers that are attached to different practices for what they consider very good reasons. I mean, Jamie, correct me, I don't know many people that farm that are farming in a way that they don't want to farm for some, it's not like they said, okay, this isn't going to work, I'm going to do this. It's just not the way it happens. People do different practices for different reasons. It's what their father taught them, it's what their mother taught them. They inherit these practices or they see them work. Because if you're going to farm, and this is as far as I'm going to get into agriculture, and I'm going to embarrass myself, but if you're going to farm, you have to make a living. And so ultimately you have to be concerned with that. If you can adopt practices that don't put you out of business, great. But we can't ask farmers to lose money doing it. So one of the interesting things that's happened is, as we, and I say we in the research community, were sort of looking for answers, they started appearing in the fields. The farmers were doing it themselves because it was good business. So now we weren't going to them saying, you ought to try this. What's happened now is the farmers are coming to us and saying, I want you to measure this, because I think what I'm doing is really making a difference. Now remember, I told you I was interested not only in water quality, but water quantity. Remember Shannon's full beakers? Remember what Jamie called this? What did he call it? Aggregated soil. Now? What else did he call it? Called it a sponge. Called it a sponge. And why did he call it a sponge? This is as bad as the 9 a.m. science class, you know that? It's the same. Was there a gathering last night or something? That's the only other thing that I know that happens like this. They put me on occasionally the night after, the morning after the social hour or something. Everybody's kind of sitting there going, oh, get this over with. So, just curious. It's a sponge. It's a sponge. So, all of a sudden, in science, one of the things that's really interesting is when you come up with something that works really well, that explains a lot of things, you're on the right path when everybody looks at it and says, of course, that's easy. Everybody can see that. Everybody sees that this works well. So we started looking at it and said, wait a second, this stores water as well. How much water does it store? How much will it affect flooding? We don't know. But we're hoping to get the answers. We're trying to investigate that right now. How much will it ultimately improve water quality? We're not sure, but what we see is really promising. Really promising. So much so that we're going to take this watershed and have it identified now and registered as a National Water Quality Initiative watershed. We're going to put 2 USGS gauges in it. 2 of them in an 8.5 square mile watershed so we can see what water is moving through this. We're going to make one of the gauges right here, right below the farm in question, a super gauge. And on that super gauge, to back up our continuous samplers in the fields, we're going to have one on each side of the stream. Down below that, we're going to put another USGS super gauge with continuous monitors on it for sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So not only will we see what the individual farmers' practices are, but we'll see what the combined practices for the watershed are like. So what's the water quality from a farm that we know is in high-level conservation management? And how does that compare to what we see in the rest of the watershed, which is managed to a very high degree already? I mean, this is a watershed where you see a lot of the practices that we want to see. We want to see what the combined effect of all of these things is. We want to watch this for the next 6 years, at least. We're hoping for more like 20. Because I think we're going to continue to learn from this. Because as you see, and you're going to hear us talk about more, our feeling is these systems just keep evolving. So that as Jamie starts planning these cocktails and mixtures, that diversity of plant materials will increase the organic material in the soil. And as you increase that organic material in the soil, you increase your holding potential. It's what makes the sponge. And so the classic number from the agronomy textbooks is for each 1% of organic material, you can store about 16,000 gallons of water per acre. You start thinking about the storage that we could get if all the soil was spongy, all the soil was holding this water, how much we could reduce runoff. And it makes me really excited to see what the future is going to be. Always knowing these were runoff problems. But it was always a question of where are you going to store the water? Where are you going to put it? I mean, and there's been lots of people offer lots of suggestions. Big retention ponds, more reservoirs, restore the wetlands. All of those things shared one characteristic. They took land out of production and land that we didn't necessarily own. We collected it. It belonged to somebody, and we were asking them to give it up. With soil health and cover crops and that complete set of practices, what we're seeing is we can get all of these things with benefits to the farm. Thank you.
So Bob gave us a good overview of what a watershed management program is and how we shrunk it down to look at each individual farms. And we have about 7 to 10 minutes left in the session. So at this time, I'd like to open it up to any questions you might have for our panelists.
Well, so how do you convince farmers that have never done it this way to get into cover crops, to get into no-till?
So you appear to be looking at me. So no, the question's an excellent one. How do you convince farmers to adopt these practices? You don't do it through me. What seems to be best, and Jamie chime in, is farmer-to-farmer communication. It doesn't take too many years of looking at your farmer getting good yields in a drought to turn to him and say, Jamie, just exactly what are you doing over there?
And Bob said it perfect earlier. You know, the farmer's goal is to farm next year. So, you know, as farmers, we've done it one way for all of our generation, my dad's generation and grandpa's generation, and it has worked. So sometimes it is tough to say, do it a different way. The other way may work too, but it's tough. But he's right. 2012 was a huge step towards soil health because of that year of the drought. And we were getting 50 bushel more per acre than the other way of farming. Others saw that very fast. you know, around Indiana, we're putting on a lot of meetings, you know, to help with that, to kind of hold their hand and get through some of the headaches so they don't have that fear of failure.
Jamie, what motivated you to make the change?
You know, I guess I got tired of sitting in the house watching a 4-inch rain or laying in bed at night and knowing that half our soil was washing away. I mean, like Shannon said, you know, we're paying good money for that ground. It doesn't do any good for us to let it leave. So, you know, the first thing is, I mean, as an investment, why do that? But second of all is, you know, we have to either leave it the same or make it better than the way we found it. So those were some of the goals and some of the thoughts for it.
So have you ever analyzed any ROI?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we're always looking at those things. I mean, it is so hard in agriculture, just like Bob said, to identify something. It's a whole system. So it is tough for us sometimes to sit down and say, this is the part that is the best of it or anything else. We won't give up any of the system. But it's not like a controlled environment. Bob runs into that all the time, you know, to where it is very tough for us to say, this is the one thing. It's the whole system and a systems approach more that we have to look at it than some of those things.
Do you know how hard it is to run a good controlled experiment on ground where people are always changing things?
Incorporation invokes a tillage. You're incorporating that into the soil. But there are technologies out there that inject the manure. It's especially more easy with a liquid manure like hog, where you can actually inject it, and it's almost like a knife, like if you're familiar with an anhydrous knife, even a little bit bigger, but it puts the manure into the soil with minimal disturbance. And there's some new technologies coming out with the more dry materials as well, like the dairy beddings and the poultry, that can get that material into the soil without inverting it. And sometimes though, you know, when that technology is not available locally, we do encourage farmers that, you know, if you're going to incorporate it, to immediately follow up with a cover crop. You know, so let's just say you set yourself back a little bit, but the organic matter and the biology within that manure is there just ready to help that soil get back in there. But if you can get that other cover crop root growing right away, almost seed the cover crop with the manure application, you can actually rebuild it pretty quick and actually regenerate and build soil rather than just degrade it by manure incorporation alone. So we're getting a lot of guys that are at least putting cover crops on with their incorporated manure.
And actually, manure is part of that system.
Yeah, manure is very valuable.
That's right. Manure is our fertilizer source. We're using pelletized chicken litter to help with some of those things. So it's not all available. We have the living cover on there all the time. But to increase biological activity and to improve the system, manure is one of those functions rather than a commercial fertilizer.
What are some efforts that are going on in other states that are feeding into the Mississippi?
They're doing things very similar to us. You know, the conservation community has always been promoting these systems. We've just finally found, I think, that one piece that was missing, and it's the cover crops and how to show a farmer the value of cover crops. And again, it comes right down to the soil. And then hearing from farmers like Jamie and a whole host of others, especially here in Indiana, but in other states as well, talking about the economics, talking about the issues they had to overcome, the lessons they've learned. I mean, we're just light years ahead now than where we were 10 years ago because technology has improved. These farmers have committed to it. They've learned the lessons. They've shared their experiences. And so now, collectively, we're just out there educating farmers to be successful. So there's a lot of other efforts outside of Indiana. We feel like we're one of the leaders. We're not the only leader, but we are definitely, from a conservation standpoint, this is what our focus is right now. And so all of our employees, from NRCS to the soil and water districts and everybody else, are promoting these systems and available to help farmers as they try to implement the no-till and the cover crops.
When starting the no-till cover crop situation, did you ever notice a problem with competition in moisture with your cash crop?
The only drawback to a cover crop is a dry spring. So no matter what we have living and pulling moisture from us at that point in time can be a negative. You know, the best example I show again is 2012. We had a spring that we had little to no rain, so the cover crop pulled whatever moisture was there. As I travel around the Midwest, I tell people that in 2012, the only way that I thought I was going to make money was to set up a toll booth at each end of our road and let them look at disaster. The amount of farm pickup trucks that drove by to look at disaster, I mean, I couldn't count them all. That was the worst case scenario. We ended up 50 bushel better than the county average with that. So does it appear at times that the system could fail us? Yes. Has it ever failed us? No. So we have learned to trust the system more after 2012 than we ever had before. We just didn't believe in that system enough. A lot of the things on moisture or planting into or killing of that cover crop, a lot of times are excuses for that farmer as a reason to why we don't want to do it. There are enough of us now, the farmers that Bob's talking about, I mean, there are several that are doing it. It can work. It's tweaking the management style to figure it out on your soil types and on your farm.
On behalf of the Conservation Technology Information Center, I'd like to say thank you for joining us and taking a look at soil health from the microscope all the way out to the watershed level. And please join me in thanking our three panelists, Shannon, Bob, and Jamie. Enjoy the rest of your time in Indianapolis.